Hi, third graders. Welcome back to your reading lesson. This is The Wind in the Willows, Lesson 2, The Riverbank, Part 2. Before we begin talking about our story, I just wanted to introduce you to some of the vocabulary words that you may not know in the story. The first one is the word arranged. Arranged means to ordered or organized specifically. So an example of that is Sally arranged the books on her shelf in alphabetical order. Another word is dejected. Dejected means depressed, unhappy, sometimes because one feels lonely or left out. An example is Wilbur the pig feels dejected when the rain spoils his plans and he can't find anyone to play with him. Another vocabulary word is escorted. Means they were led or accompanied. An example of that is Dell's teacher escorted her to the principal's office after she misbehaved in class. Another word is seized. Means grabbed or took hold of suddenly. An example is Jacob seized the handrail to keep from falling down the stairs. And then our last vocabulary word is stability. It's the condition of being firm or not likely to move or change. An example of this is it was hard for Sherry to maintain stability on her bike when she was first learning how to ride, but after lots of practice, she no longer falls off. So those are some words that you may not know that you will hear in the story. All right, so what have we learned so far? So our story, The Wind in the Willows, we know is a classic, right? And our story takes place near a riverbank. And we know that the setting of our story begins at Mole's house. And do you remember what Mole was doing at his house at the beginning of the story? Something he wasn't a big fan of. If you remember right, he was spring cleaning. And he grows weary of it, so he decides to burrow out of his house that he lives in to the world above, and he discovers a lot is going on. He discovers it's spring, and he meanders along the river and meets water rat. So meanders is a fun word. It means to move slowly. And water rat tells Mole about life on the river as Rat rows along the river. So that's where we left our story, is that our two main characters so far, Mole and Rat, are rowing in a boat together, and Rat has packed a big picnic basket. So far we've heard many examples of personification, right? Personification is when animals and objects act like they're people. So what are some things that Mole and Rat are doing that a mole and rat wouldn't actually do that people actually do? Right? They're wearing clothes, they're living in houses, they're riding in a boat, and they've packed a picnic. That seems very people-y to me. So those are good examples of personification. So Mole learns from Rat about life on the river, and he learns this through speaking to Rat. And when we see the text, we see dialogue, right? Dialogue is when characters are speaking together. And we know it's dialogue because dialogue has quotation marks around it. So as you can see this example right here, dialogue has quotation marks around it. So we know that it's the characters that are talking. Dialogue is one way an author can describe a person, place, or thing, or give the reader information in a story. So we've learned a lot already about the riverbank and our characters from what Rat and Mole have said to each other. All right, when it's not dialogue, when it's just talking about the characters and the setting and the story and what's happening, and characters aren't talking, that's called narration. Okay? When there's someone else, someone is talking about what's happening, but the characters aren't talking, that's called narration. And narration and dialogue are two literary tools, or two ways the author tells a story. So an author uses those two tools to help make their story more interesting and for the reader to understand. So the part of the story that tells what's happening and does not have quotation marks around it is narration. So let's look at part of our story from yesterday and what part is dialogue and what part is narration. It says the rat said nothing but stooped and fastened a rope and hauled on it, then lightly stepped into a little boat which the mole had not observed. It was painted blue outside and white within, and was just the size for two animals, and the mole loved it immediately. Okay, have any of the characters talked in that paragraph? No. So that means that whole paragraph is narration. We haven't had any dialogue yet. The rat sculled across. Then he held up his forepaw as the mole stepped gingerly down. "Lean on that," he said. "Now then, step lively." And the mole, in his great delight, found himself actually seated in the stern of a real boat. "This has been a wonderful day," said he, as the rat shoved off and took to the sculls again. Okay, so we have a lot of dialogue there. So the parts that are in quotation marks, such as "lean on that" and "now then, step lively," are dialogue. They're things that are being said by the character. The rest of it, like "and the mole, to his great delight, found himself actually seated in the stern of a real boat," is narration because it's said by the narrator, it's not said by a character. All right, what is perspective? We're going to talk about perspective quite a bit. All right, perspective is who we're seeing, like what's going on. So like right now we followed Mole around. So we're seeing things from Mole's perspective. We're in Mole's house, and then he comes out into the spring air and down to the river, and we're following Mole around, and we see what Mole sees and what Mole is doing. So we're following Mole's perspective, not Rat's, because we started out with Mole in his house and we're following him around. So perspective is how someone sees or experiences something. It lets the reader know from whose experience the scene of the story is mainly being described. Perspective can shift from one character to another as a way of telling more about the story. Okay, so we might be seeing Mole's perspective now, but that doesn't mean that the next chapter is going to be all about Mole's perspective. We might start following another character around. All right, in this chapter, you're going to learn about a new character. You're going to learn about a character. Well, these are the characters we've already kind of talked about a little bit. We have Mole and Water Rat. I've told you that there's going to be a badger and a toad in our story, but there's also an otter. All right, so here's a picture of an otter. Adult otters are animals around 25 to 35 inches in length, not including their tail, which is long, which can also be 14 to 18 inches long. Otters live in and around the water. Like badgers, otters also belong to the weasel family. Otters are playful creatures and great swimmers. They are semi-aquatic, which means they spend time in and out of the water, like water rats do. They have brownish fur on their backs, cream-colored bellies, long, strong necks, webbed feet, and a long, flattened tail. They live in burrows they dig into riverbanks. Otters eat fish, shellfish, birds, insects, and frogs. Otters have backbones. Their skeletons are inside their bodies. They're warm-blooded mammals, which is something we're going to talk about in our next unit when we start classifying animals. All right, so they are mammals. Okay, so let's make a prediction about this read aloud. What do you think is going to happen? This is the riverbank part 2, and we know kind of how our riverbank story starts with Mole and Rat in the boat about to go on a picnic. What do you think is going to happen next? Why? So the stories in this domain are considered fantasies. And this means that the stories have parts that could not happen in real life. So maybe there's something that you think will happen that couldn't actually happen in real life, but you predict is going to happen in the story. All right. So here's some of our words that we went over: arrange, dejected, escorted, seized, stability. Okay, so try to listen to those words as we go through the read aloud. So go to the next video to see the read aloud.